If he ran, he died, and if he stayed, the army survived. That's the choice Sergeant Tommy Prince faced in February 1944, standing in an abandoned farmhouse just 200 meters from German artillery, when his communication wire was severed by enemy shelling, when running would save his life but doom the Allied attack, when staying meant walking into German gun sites in broad daylight. This is the story of Tommy Prince, Canada's most decorated Indigenous soldier. The story of a man who repaired a telephone wire while enemy soldiers watched. The story of stealth, deception, and nerves of absolute steel. But this is not a story about perfect military planning or overwhelming firepower. This is a story about one man who walked through enemy lines like a ghost. Thomas George Prince was born on October 25, 1915. He entered the world in a canvas tent in Petersfield, Manitoba, Canada. He was one of 11 children born to Henry and Arabella Prince. The Prince family belonged to the Broken Head Band of Ojibwa First Nations. Tommy was a direct descendant of Peguis, the legendary Saulteaux chief. Chief Peguis had led his band of 200 Ojibwa from Sault Ste. Marie. They traveled to the Red River in the 1790s, establishing a new homeland. Tommy also descended from Chief William Prince, who led the Ojibwa Manitoba Nile Voyageurs. Warrior blood ran through Tommy Prince's veins from both sides of his family. When Tommy was 5 years old, his family moved to the Broken Head Reserve in Scanterbury. This is where Tommy learned the skills that would one day save his life and the lives of countless soldiers. His father was a hunter and a trapper who knew the wilderness intimately. He taught Tommy to track game through dense forest without making a sound. He taught him to read weather patterns in the color of clouds and the direction of wind. He taught him to move through hostile territory without leaving a trace. Tommy became an expert marksman who could hit a target from incredible distances. He could navigate by stars, by moss on trees, by the flow of water. He learned patience, the ability to remain motionless for hours while observing prey. These traditional skills would translate perfectly to military reconnaissance and sniping. But Tommy's path to military service was not easy. He applied to join the Canadian military several times before the war. Each time he was rejected without explanation. Indigenous people faced widespread discrimination throughout Canada in the 1930s. The military was no exception to this shameful prejudice. Tommy was a survivor of the residential school system that attempted to erase Indigenous culture. He had experienced firsthand the racism that defined Canadian society at the time. But when World War II broke out in September 1939, everything changed. Canada desperately needed soldiers, and suddenly the rules relaxed. On June 3, 1940, Tommy Prince finally enlisted in the Canadian Army. He was 24 years old and ready to prove himself. Tommy was assigned to the 1st Field Park Company of the Royal Canadian Engineers. He later said, "As soon as I put on my uniform, I felt a better man." The uniform represented respect, purpose, and belonging in a way civilian life never had. By 1942, Tommy had risen to the rank of sergeant with the Canadian Parachute Battalion. He was an excellent soldier who excelled in every aspect of military training. Then in September 1942, something extraordinary happened. Tommy was selected for a highly classified and secretive new unit. He was sent to Fort Benning, Georgia, where Canadians and Americans were forming a special force. This would become the first special service force, soon to be known worldwide. The Germans would call them the Black Devils, or the Devil's Brigade. The security and secrecy surrounding this unit were unprecedented. American and Canadian volunteers were transported to Helena, Montana by train. The windows on the trains were blacked out so no one would know where they were headed. The first Special Service Force was originally intended as a parachute unit. The plan was to drop behind enemy lines in Norway and sabotage German installations. But the unit evolved into something different and far more deadly. They became a versatile assault group with a reputation for specialized reconnaissance and raiding. The Devil's Brigade was made up of 1,800 American and Canadian soldiers. Many were lumberjacks, forest rangers, hunters, and game wardens. These were men who knew how to survive in harsh conditions and move silently through wilderness. They received intensive training in stealth tactics, hand-to-hand combat, and demolition. They even had a specially designed fighting knife made for them called the V-42. Before night operations, they would paint their faces black with shoe polish. They would sneak into enemy positions and kill silently with knives and garrots. Tommy Prince was perfectly suited for this elite unit. His tracking skills, marksmanship, and ability to move like a shadow made him invaluable. The first official mission for the Devil's Brigade was to liberate the Aleutian Islands. The Japanese had captured the islands of Attu and Kiska in 1942. In August 1943, the 1st Special Service Force disembarked on both islands. They found that the Japanese had already fled, abandoning their positions. For Tommy Prince, it was a huge disappointment after months of intensive training. But he wouldn't have to wait long for real combat. As soon as the unit returned to the United States, they were ordered to sail for Europe. Their specialized skills were desperately needed in the Italian campaign. The Allies had successfully conquered Sicily and were now pushing into mainland Italy. But the Germans had established formidable defensive positions in the mountains. The Devil's Brigade arrived in Casablanca in French Algeria in November 1943. They quickly moved to Naples, Italy, arriving on November 19th. They were immediately sent into the line with the U.S. 36th Infantry Division. The first major objective was Monte la Defensa, a strategic mountain position. This mountain anchored the German Bernhardt Line defenses near the ancient town of Rocca di Vandro. American and British forces had already attempted to take Monte la Defensa 3 times. Each assault had failed with heavy casualties against the impenetrable German defenses. The mountain sat surrounded by steep cliffs that seemed impossible to climb. German machine gun and artillery positions covered every approach. The Devil's Brigade was given the mission that everyone else had failed to accomplish. Between December 3rd and December 6th, 1943, they proved why they were special. In the dead of winter, carrying over 70 pounds of gear each, they marched all night through freezing temperatures until they reached the tree line. They were 300 meters short of German positions when they stopped. They hid all throughout the day, lying as still as humanly possible. Then, when the moon came out, they pulled out climbing equipment and ropes. They scaled the steepest cliff face in complete darkness and silence. Carrying weapons in one hand and grenades in the other, they climbed like ghosts. The Germans never expected anyone to be crazy enough to climb that cliff at night. The Devil's Brigade reached the summit and attacked from behind with fixed bayonets. They wiped out the strategic defensive position in brutal close-quarters combat. The battle lasted 2 hours, and when it was over, Monte la Defensa was theirs. The next day, Allied forces walked up the mountain after the Devil's Brigade had done the impossible. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The Devil's Brigade suffered a 77% casualty rate during the mountain campaign. Out of 1,800 men, more than 1,300 were killed or wounded. They continued immediately to assault Monte la Remetanea from December 6th to 9th. They captured Monte Sambucaro on Christmas Day 1943. They assaulted Monte Visciataro on January 8, 1944. The next objective was Monte Maggio, which presented an almost insurmountable problem. German artillery and machine gun emplacements were arranged in layers on the steep slopes. An attack on any one position would alert all the other defenses. Any assaulting force would be met with withering fire from multiple directions. Lieutenant Colonel Gilday was desperate to devise some strategy for the assault. He called on Tommy Prince to lead a patrol and eliminate the German gun emplacements. This had to be done silently, without alerting the main German positions on the summit. If Prince's mission succeeded, it would allow the main force to assault Monte Maggio. The offensive was planned for January 8, 1944. Captain Mark Radcliffe, the commanding officer for the attack, watched Prince depart. He later remarked that Tommy Prince moved just like a shadow. Under cover of darkness, Prince led his patrol partway up the lower slopes of Monte Maggio. He positioned his men as a supporting group in case covering fire was needed. Then Tommy Prince went forward alone into the German positions. He moved through the night without making a single sound that would alert the enemy. He approached the first German gun emplacement on the lower slopes. Using skills learned hunting in the forests of Manitoba, he entered silently. He eliminated the German gunners and soldiers without firing a shot or setting off alarms. He moved to the next gun position, then the next, working his way up the mountain. One after another, he neutralized German emplacements on the lower and middle slopes. This required executing his orders without making any sound whatsoever. Any noise would arouse the other German positions and doom the entire operation. Prince returned before dawn and reported his mission was complete. All the German gun pits on the planned attack route had been eliminated. When the Devil's Brigade moved up Monte Majo, they saw the silent German bunkers. The soldiers immediately knew that Tommy had done what they called a beautiful job. Prince's silent actions allowed the brigade to surprise the enemy completely. They reached the summit of Monte Majo without firing a single shot. The enemy was taken by complete surprise when the full assault came. Once in control of the summit, the force used captured German heavy machine guns. They repelled a long series of fierce German counterattacks over several days. The distinctive sound of German guns confused the counterattacking soldiers. German troops would shout out in confusion, "Stop shooting at us, we are Germans!" Tommy Prince was involved in these later actions to defend the summit. For security reasons, he received no individual award for his single-handed mission. But he did receive the Battle Honor Mount Majo for his extraordinary action. In January 1944, the Devil's Brigade was pulled from the mountains. They had been reduced from 1,800 men to only 400. On February 1st, they were landed at the beachhead created by Operation Shingle at Anzio. This was south of Rome, where Allied forces had been contained for months. The 1,200 remaining soldiers of the 1st Special Service Force were tasked with holding several miles of perimeter. They faced an entire German division in a protracted and bloody stalemate. Their job was to hold and raid from the right flank of the beachhead. This position was marked by the Mussolini Canal and the Pontine Marshes. It was at Anzio where the Germans truly learned to fear the Devil's Brigade. The soldiers would paint their faces black with shoe polish before night operations. They would sneak past Nazi security guards and leave threatening messages. They would steal boots right off sleeping German soldiers without waking them. They would kill every third man in a barracks with a knife to the throat. The next morning, survivors would wake to find the man next to them dead. This psychological warfare drove German troops to the edge of terror. Tommy Prince became an expert in this deadly game of reconnaissance and harassment. Whenever he needed to move quietly, Prince would remove his army-issue boots. He would wear traditional moccasins that made absolutely no sound on any surface. At night, he would venture out into no man's land between the opposing armies. He would choose a hidden vantage point and target any German who wandered within range. Prince maintained a regular sniping schedule under his own initiative. On one occasion, he went searching for a German sniper who had been targeting Devil's Brigade positions. The two ace snipers exchanged fire in a personal duel among the ruins. Prince eventually shot the German, who fell dead from a tree where he'd been hiding. Prince built up such a fierce reputation that Germans gave him special nicknames. They called him Geist, which means ghost in German. They also called him Teufel, which means devil. German soldiers believed Prince was some kind of evil spirit. Before long, the German division opposing the 1st Special Service Force retreated. They pulled back nearly 2.5 miles from direct contact with the Devil's Brigade. They were apparently shaken by the relentless night activity and psychological warfare. But Tommy Prince's most celebrated action was still to come. On February 5, 1944, near Littoria, Italy, Lieutenant Colonel Gilday had a problem. He needed accurate intelligence on German artillery positions and assembly points. Without this information, Allied counterattacks would be firing blind. Gilday sent reconnaissance Sergeant Tommy Prince forward to spy on the Germans. Prince scouted the area and found a small abandoned yellow farmhouse. This farmhouse sat just 200 meters from major German gun positions. From the farmhouse windows, Prince had a clear view of enemy artillery emplacements. He could see German soldiers moving supplies and positioning their guns. Prince reported back to Gilday with details about this perfect observation post. But when Prince failed to return the following day, Gilday feared the worst. He thought Prince had been killed or captured by German patrols. Then 2 nights later, Prince suddenly emerged from the darkness. He walked into Gilday's command post and explained what had happened. After finding the farmhouse, Prince had discovered that German patrols were using it. They would arrive and occupy the house temporarily before moving on. Prince had hidden inside the farmhouse while Germans came and went around him. He remained absolutely silent and still, observing everything. Gilday was amazed that Prince was still alive after such a close call. But Prince wasn't done yet. He had a plan to make this observation post permanent. The following night, February 8th, Gilday sent Prince back to the farmhouse. This time, Prince carried 1,400 meters of telephone wire. That's nearly a mile of communications cable that he had to run without being detected. Prince laid the wire carefully from Allied lines to the abandoned farmhouse. He set up an observation post inside with a field telephone connection. From this position, he had a clear view of German artillery positions and troop movements. He could now report enemy locations directly to Allied artillery commanders. Prince settled in for what would become a 3-day solo watch. He was alone, 200 meters from the enemy, with only a telephone for company. He began calling in precise coordinates of German gun emplacements. American artillery started making it rain fire and shrapnel on German positions. Tanks and guns that had been terrorizing Allied troops began exploding. The Germans could not understand how the Allies suddenly had such accurate targeting. They began firing back at suspected Allied observation points. An artillery duel developed as both sides tried to destroy each other's guns. German shells screamed overhead and exploded all around the farmhouse. Then disaster struck. One of the German artillery rounds cut Prince's telephone wire. The connection went dead in the middle of his report. Back at Allied headquarters, officers assumed Prince had been killed by the shelling. They had lost communication with their best forward observer at a critical moment. But Tommy Prince was very much alive and facing an impossible decision. The telephone wire had been severed somewhere between the farmhouse and Allied lines. Prince needed to go outside, find the break, and repair it. But going outside meant exposing himself in broad daylight. German soldiers were just 200 meters away with rifles and machine guns. If he ran, they would see the movement and kill him instantly. If he stayed hidden, the communication link would remain severed. The Allied artillery would lose its eyes, and the German counterattack would succeed. Soldiers would die because Prince couldn't provide targeting information. If he ran, he died, and if he stayed, the army survived. Tommy Prince looked out at the German positions and made his decision. He would go outside, find the break in the wire, and repair it. But he would not run, and he would not hide. Instead, he would walk right past the Germans in plain sight. Prince removed his military uniform and weapons. He found civilian clothes inside the abandoned farmhouse. He put on a farmer's old shirt and work pants that had been left behind. He grabbed a hoe that was leaning against the farmhouse wall. Then Tommy Prince walked out into the daylight where German soldiers could see him. He began pretending to work in the field, hoeing the ground like a simple farmer. He moved slowly and casually, showing no sign of fear or urgency. German soldiers 200 meters away watched this lone farmer working his field. They could see him clearly through their binoculars and rifle scopes. Prince worked his way across the field, hoeing the dirt in a random pattern. But his path was not random at all. He was following the telephone wire. He searched for the break while maintaining his disguise as a poor Italian peasant. Every few steps he would stop and lean on his hoe to rest. During these pauses, he was actually examining the wire for damage. The Germans kept watching him, but they saw nothing suspicious. Just another starving Italian farmer trying to grow food in a war zone. Prince finally found the severed wire about halfway between the farmhouse and Allied lines. He sat down on the ground as if taking a break from his hard labor. He untied one of his boots and removed the lace completely. German observers watched through their scopes as the farmer fixed his footwear. They had no idea what was really happening just 600 feet away. Prince took the two severed ends of the telephone wire in his hands. He twisted them together carefully, making sure the connection was solid. Then he used his bootlace to bind the twisted wires together. He wrapped the lace around and around the repair, securing it tightly. From 200 meters away, it looked like he was just fixing his boot. The Germans never suspected that he was repairing a military communications line. Prince finished the repair, retied his boot with the remaining lace, and stood up. He picked up his hoe and continued working his way back toward the farmhouse. He moved slowly and deliberately, never breaking character as a simple farmer. The entire repair operation had taken less than 10 minutes. When Prince reached the farmhouse, he quickly changed back into his uniform. He picked up the field telephone and tested the connection. The line was working perfectly, and Allied headquarters came back on immediately. They were shocked to hear Prince's voice and overjoyed that he was still alive. Prince calmly resumed calling in coordinates of German artillery positions. American guns began firing again with devastating accuracy. The Germans still had no idea where the spotter was located. They never connected the Italian farmer in the field with the accurate artillery fire. Prince remained in that farmhouse for 3 full days, calling in targets. He directed fire that destroyed multiple German gun positions and killed numerous enemy soldiers. His intelligence reports were critical to the success of Allied operations in that sector. When Prince finally returned to Allied lines, his commanders were amazed. They had given him up for dead when the telephone line went silent. When they heard the story of how he repaired the wire in full view of the enemy, they were stunned. The bootlace repair became legendary among the Devil's Brigade. For this action, Tommy Prince was recommended for the Military Medal. The citation praised his coolness and daring in maintaining the observation post. It specifically mentioned his great courage and resourcefulness in repairing the wire under enemy observation. Prince received the Military Medal from King George VI himself. He also received the American Silver Star for the same action. The Americans recognized that Prince's intelligence had saved countless Allied lives. Tommy Prince became one of Canada's most decorated soldiers of World War II. But the farmhouse telephone wire incident was not his only remarkable achievement. In May 1944, the Devil's Brigade participated in the breakout from Anzio. They spearheaded the attack that finally broke the German defensive line. The brigade fought their way toward Rome through fierce German resistance. On June 4, 1944, 2 days before D-Day in Normandy, Rome fell to the Allies. The 1st Special Service Force was among the first Allied units to enter the city. Italian civilians lined the streets, cheering and throwing flowers at the liberators. After Rome, the Devil's Brigade was pulled from Italy and sent to southern France. On August 15, 1944, they participated in Operation Dragoon. This was the Allied invasion of southern France along the Mediterranean coast. The force landed on the islands of Port-Cros and Levant to secure the invasion flank. They captured heavily fortified German positions in brutal close-quarters fighting. Tommy Prince continued his pattern of exceptional service throughout the southern France campaign. He conducted reconnaissance missions deep behind enemy lines. He sniped German officers and disrupted enemy communications. He gathered intelligence that allowed Allied forces to avoid ambushes and plan effective attacks. By December 1944, the 1st Special Service Force had been decimated by casualties. The unit had suffered a casualty rate of over 100% during its combat operations. This meant that every original member had been killed or wounded, at least once. Many positions had been filled 2 or 3 times with replacement soldiers. The Devil's Brigade was officially disbanded on December 5, 1944. The American soldiers returned to U.S. Army units, and the Canadians returned to Canadian formations. Tommy Prince was sent back to Canada for a well-deserved rest. He had served in continuous combat for nearly 2 years without a break. He had been wounded multiple times and survived countless close calls with death. He was promoted to sergeant and decorated with medals from 2 countries. But Prince's military service was not over yet. In 1950, the Korean War broke out, and Prince volunteered to serve again. He was 34 years old, much older than most soldiers, but his skills as a reconnaissance specialist and sniper were still in demand. Prince joined the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Prince's reconnaissance work helped save the battalion from being surrounded and destroyed. He served in Korea from 1950 to 1952, fighting in some of the war's bloodiest battles. He participated in the Battle of Kapyong in April 1951. This was a desperate defensive action, where Canadian forces held against overwhelming Chinese attacks. For his Korean War service, Prince received the U.S. Presidential Unit Citation. He also received the Korean Service Medal and the United Nations Service Medal. By the time he left Korea, Tommy Prince had become Canada's most decorated Indigenous soldier. He had served his country in 2 wars over a span of 12 years. He had earned 11 medals and decorations from 3 different countries. But when Prince returned to civilian life in Canada, he faced a harsh reality. The respect and equality he experienced in uniform disappeared the moment he took it off. Prince struggled to find work despite his military record. Employers who celebrated his heroism in the newspapers wouldn't hire him because he was Indigenous. He worked odd jobs, logging and cleaning, work far beneath his abilities. The man who had been trusted with the most dangerous missions in 2 wars couldn't get a decent civilian job. Prince suffered from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. He had nightmares about the men he killed and the friends he lost. He turned to alcohol to dull the memories and the pain of discrimination. His marriage fell apart, and he became estranged from his children. By the 1960s, Prince was living in poverty in Winnipeg. Canada's most decorated Indigenous soldier was sleeping in homeless shelters. In 1970, Prince became an advocate for Indigenous veterans' rights. He spoke out about the discrimination that Indigenous soldiers faced after returning from war. He fought for better benefits and recognition for Indigenous veterans. His advocacy work brought attention to systemic injustices that had been ignored for decades. In 1977, Tommy Prince's health began to fail. Years of combat wounds, hard living, and untreated PTSD had taken their toll. He developed lung cancer, likely from years of smoking and exposure to battlefield chemicals. On November 25, 1977, Tommy Prince died in Deer Lodge Hospital in Winnipeg. He was 62 years old and died essentially penniless. But even in death, Tommy Prince received the recognition he deserved. The Canadian military gave him a funeral with full military honors. Soldiers carried his flag-draped coffin while bagpipes played. Veterans from both World War II and Korea attended to pay their respects. Indigenous leaders spoke about Prince's courage and his fight for veterans' rights. He was buried in Brookside Cemetery in Winnipeg, with his medals on display. In the years since his death, Tommy Prince's legacy has only grown. In 1995, Canada Post issued a commemorative stamp honoring Prince. Schools, roads, and military buildings across Canada have been named after him. The Canadian Armed Forces established the Sergeant Tommy Prince Award. This award recognizes outstanding Indigenous members of the military. In 2016, a statue of Tommy Prince was unveiled at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. The statue shows Prince in his Devil's Brigade uniform, ready for combat. Military historians now recognize Prince as one of Canada's greatest soldiers. His tactics are still studied in special forces training programs around the world. The telephone wire repair with a bootlace is taught as an example of improvisation under fire. Prince's story has been featured in books, documentaries, and educational programs. The Devil's Brigade itself has become legendary in military history. Their exploits inspired movies, including the 1968 film, The Devil's Brigade. Modern special forces units trace their lineage and tactics back to this elite group. The U.S. Army Special Forces consider the Devil's Brigade as their spiritual ancestors. But Tommy Prince's legacy goes beyond military achievement. He became a symbol of Indigenous contributions to Canadian military history. More than 12,000 Indigenous Canadians served in World War II. Thousands more served in Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts. Many faced the same discrimination after the war that Prince experienced. Prince's advocacy work helped bring attention to these injustices. His courage in speaking out inspired a new generation of Indigenous veterans to demand equal treatment. The story of the farmhouse telephone wire remains Prince's most celebrated action. It perfectly captures everything that made Tommy Prince extraordinary. The situational awareness to recognize that running meant death. The creativity to disguise himself as a farmer and walk in plain sight. The improvisation to repair a telephone wire with a bootlace. The courage to do all of this while German rifles were pointed at him. Most soldiers would have stayed hidden and let the communication line remain broken. Most would have chosen personal survival over mission success. But Tommy Prince was not like most soldiers. He understood that if he ran, he died, but if he stayed, the army survived. So he stayed, walking through enemy lines like a ghost, repairing a vital communications link while German soldiers watched through their scopes. Never breaking character, never showing fear, never giving up. The lessons from Tommy Prince's life extend far beyond military tactics. His story teaches us about courage under impossible pressure. It teaches us about creative problem-solving when conventional solutions fail. It teaches us about duty and sacrifice in service of something larger than ourselves. But Prince's story also teaches us about the tragedy of discrimination. A man who risked everything for his country should not have died in poverty. A decorated war hero should not have struggled to find work because of his race. The same society that celebrated Prince's heroism failed him when he needed support. This painful contradiction is part of Prince's legacy too. Today, when military instructors teach special forces tactics, they tell Prince's stories. They talk about the silent elimination of German gun positions on Monte Majo, They discuss the psychological warfare that earned him the nickname Ghost. And they always mention the farmhouse and the telephone wire and the bootlace, because that story perfectly illustrates what special operations is all about. It's not about superior weapons or overwhelming force. It's about one person making the impossible choice in an impossible situation. It's about refusing to accept defeat when every rational option has failed. It's about walking through enemy lines when everyone says it can't be done. Tommy Prince did all of this and more during his years of service. He proved that courage comes in many forms, and heroism often looks like quiet determination. He showed that the greatest warriors are often those who think differently, who use intelligence and creativity alongside physical courage, who understand that sometimes the best way forward is straight through the enemy. If he ran, he died, and if he stayed, the army survived. Tommy Prince chose to stay every single time, and because he stayed, countless soldiers lived to see another day. That is the legacy of Sergeant Thomas George Prince, the man who walked through enemy lines like a ghost, the man who repaired a telephone wire with a bootlace while German soldiers watched, the man who refused to run when running was the only rational choice, Canada's most decorated Indigenous soldier, and one of the finest warriors of World War II. His story deserves to be remembered, studied, and celebrated, not just for the incredible acts of courage, but for what they teach us about the human spirit.